Welcome and thank you for attending the Black History Matters series presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. My name is Victoria Basulto, and I am a current senior at Colgate University, located in Hamilton, New York, and am an intern with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, known as NAHOF. I will be facilitating the series of 28 presentations that will be released throughout the month of February 2021 and that you can view on our YouTube channel or on our website. I will now lead you through some introductory statements. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is located in Peterborough, New York, in the building that you can see on the screen where the inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society was held in 1835. NAHOF's mission is as follows. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. NAHOF has worked in coordination with the Garrett Smith Estate National Historic Landmark, which is also located in Peterborough, New York, to create the Black History Matters series. The following statement is the purpose of the Black History Matters series. NAHOF supports racial justice movements seeking to address racial inequality, given their resonance with NAHOF's mission to address the second and ongoing abolition to end racism. NAHOF believes a significant number of Americans do not understand the current racial justice protest due to their unfamiliarity with 4 centuries of Black American history because this history was either excluded or taught inadequately in schools. NAHOF knows that education is a powerful step towards ending racism, and that understanding the history of the enslavement and dehumanization of Black Americans provides critical context for the ongoing racial justice movements and the persistence of racism in America. Given NAHOF's commitment to strengthening knowledge of history as one route to confront racism, NAHOF will present Black History Matters, a series of crash courses covering some examples of neglected topics in Black American history throughout the month of February in 2021. I'd like to now welcome our presenter, Dr. Hogle. Dr. Hogle is a professor of social science at SUNY Morrisville, located in Morrisville, New York. Dr. Hogle has a BA from SUNY Oswego and an MA from SUNY Plattsburgh, and a PhD from University of Colorado at Boulder Creek. Dr. Hogle served in the United States Army from 1966 to 1969 in Vietnam, in 1967 to 1968 in the 9th Infantry Division, and he received the Combat Infantry Badge. He was born in Washington, D.C., and his parents met in the Army taking care of General John C. Pershing's. Dr. Hogle is also the oldest of 12 children and was raised in Syracuse and Manoa, New York. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Hogle to begin his presentation on the 14th Amendment. That being, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're continuing on our presentation, investigation of the Reconstruction Era and its effects then and to an extent now. And I want to encapsulate what I talked about the last time. I talked about slavery being the original sin of the United States Republic. I talked about the compromises that were needed in order to keep the southern states in the Union, the 3/5 compromise being the chief one, which allowed 3/5 of all slaves to be counted towards representation in the House of Representatives. And that eventually the southern states had, I believe, 52 extra electoral votes based on slaves, chattel slaves, legally had the same status as horses and cows. They couldn't vote. Anyway, it was a necessary compromise. Politics is the art of the possible, and Northerners needed it in order to get a ratification of the Constitution. Many people at the time thought slavery would go away, but with the Industrial Revolution coming out of England, with these massive factories, with massive machines run by water power and eventually steam power, cotton, which has been cleared of its seeds in a remarkable machine called the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney. We have tremendous need for cotton. Cotton is king. Over 55% of our exports by the 1850s are cotton. Textile factories in New England operate on cotton. The factories of France and England rely on cotton. That cotton is grown and harvested and tended by slaves, chattel slaves. We had roughly 700,000 to 800,000 slaves at the time of the federal Constitution. By the 1850s, there are 4.5 million slaves. And more millionaires per capita were in the South rather than the North. It produced wealth, unbelievable wealth. Now, there weren't many big cities in the South. They didn't have a lot of factories. Their cities tended to be on the Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico. They needed them as ports. So industrially, the South was behind, but they were tied to slavery. Missouri Compromise allowed every time a southern state wanted into the Southern Territory wanted into the Union, as long as there was a northern state to offset it, we could keep a tie between the South and the northern states, slave and free. It fell apart when we won the war against Mexico, gained the Mexican cession, and now we have a new, stronger fight over slavery. Southerners said, we provided most of the soldiers for the Mexican victory, which they did. We want that territory to be open to slavery. Much of it was above the Missouri Compromise, the southern boundary of Missouri. Northerners said, no, free soil, free land, free men, no slavery in the territories. The South got a chance for squatter sovereignty with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which allowed settlers, new settlers in a territory to take a vote and decide whether they were going to allow slavery or allow no slavery. It led to fighting between Northerners and Jayhawkers. Jayhawkers were the Northerners and pro-Southern settlers. And Bleeding Kansas was a symbol of a coming war. They couldn't agree. Religion split right down the middle. Presbyterian, Southern Presbyterian, Baptist, Southern Baptist, Methodist, Southern Methodist. If you can't agree on how to worship your God, political compromise is going to be hard. Now, the war begins when Abraham Lincoln, who had taken on Senator Douglas in the 1858 Illinois senatorial election, they were the two leading spokesman for their party. Although Lincoln wasn't at the beginning of the debates, he certainly was at the end. He said where slavery is, it cannot be taken away. But he did not favor extension into the territories of slavery. Douglas said squatter sovereignty would allow the citizens of that territory to make a decision. The South, by 1859, there has been a raid on Harper's Ferry Armory in Virginia by John Brown. It has panicked the South. They view Lincoln as a black Republican, and they threaten to secede if he is elected president. He does not run in the South. He only wins votes in the North. But the North is so populous by now, and they stretch all the way to California, Washington, Oregon, that Lincoln wins the electoral majority, even though he gets only 38% of the vote. There were three other party candidates running: a Northern Democrat, Douglas, a Southern Democrat, Breckinridge, a Union Party, and in a divided electorate, Lincoln wins. And now the descent to war begins. And as a war measure, Lincoln decides to free all blacks held in the Confederacy. Practically, he doesn't free anybody. The South has still got them under guard. But the promise of freedom is in the eyes of the Southern slave, and they flee to the advancing Union armies. Black troops are enlisted into the United States Army and Navy and fight gallantly throughout the war. But Lincoln has called it a war measure. His Emancipation Proclamation, he knows it won't hold after the war. He pushes that there be another way. And his party becomes more and more radical. They want to humiliate the South, and they want an amendment ending slavery once and for all, which they got, the 13th Amendment. I must tell you that John Crittenden of Kentucky had proposed a compromise of 4 amendments, which allowed settlement of the Mexican cession above the southern border of Missouri, and would have made an amendment guaranteeing slavery in the United States in perpetuity. Instead, after a bloody war with estimated 800,000 dead, we got a completely different 13th Amendment, which ended slavery on January 31st of 1865. Unfortunately, President Lincoln had been assassinated by John Wilkes Booth and had died on April 15th, 1865. And by the way, I said January 31st. It passed on December 31st, 1865. Excuse me. Now, we go on. We have a vice president that Lincoln picked, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. With Lincoln's death, he has become president. He is a bigoted, racist, Southern white man. He does not like the plantation owners who led his section into an unwinnable war, but he certainly doesn't have any respect or any desire to help blacks. He tries to allow the Southern Confederates to reorganize their government, elect new leaders, and take their place in the House and Senate. They go forward and elect former generals, former members of the Confederate government, judges and military men who renounce their oath of loyalty to the United States. And now they're going to try to get back into the United States Senate, the United States House. They are stopped at the door. They are not recognized. Johnson in Congress, led by the radical Republicans, fight it out. In 1866, they pass a funding bill for the Freedmen's Bureau, run by the War Department, which was educating black and white children, delivering food, adjudicating work contracts, because many southern states said that blacks had to have a contract before the end of January, or they would be sold to the highest bidder for the rest of the year. Slavery in all but name. Now, the 1866 Civil Rights Act is vetoed by Johnson, but the Senate and the House, with 2/3 votes of both houses, override it. This will be the kernel of the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is ratified in 1868. It says that all people born in America are by birthright citizens, and they are entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizen, and that none of these rights, privileges, and immunities can be removed without due process of law. Now, the 14th Amendment is the most important amendment of the 3 we are discussing because of the citizenship, but even more important, you cannot take away a person's rights without due process of law. You can be convicted of a crime and put in jail. You can be executed, but you must be convicted by due process. Now, the other thing we get in the 20th century, after the 14th Amendment is passed, something called incorporation. What it means is that we have to go back to the Constitutional Convention. The Bill of Rights was offered by the Federalist group led by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, the leading fathers of our country. And they were written and accepted. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. They were seen as a protection from the federal government encroaching on the natural rights of members of the 13 states. And you were not protected from your state. If your state discriminated against you, you had no recourse. If the federal government came after you, well, then you had the Bill of Rights. Well, what Americans soon realize, it's the states that are carrying out the misdeeds. It's not the federal government. For the most part, it's the southern states, it's northern states who will not allow free blacks into their state. Even though the Constitution says that all citizens should be granted all the rights, privileges, and immunities in any state they go. It is blatantly violated by the states. The 14th Amendment makes it incumbent on the national government to maintain the rights of all citizens, and this means the Bill of Rights. By the 20th century, in a process called incorporation, we see tremendous lawsuits go to the Supreme Court, and the defense is that the state is taking away the privileges of a citizen without due process. And we get cases where you cannot be forbidden by publication. You can only be charged with libel after the publication. We get in 1965 that birth control was not allowed to be sent to married couples in Connecticut. Griswold versus Connecticut, they won. Birth control information was allowed. It was not pornography because it interfered with their right and privileges and immunities as a citizen. Roe v. Wade allowed early abortion within the first trimester for the same thing. It even came up with a mystical right to privacy, which still drives conservative originalists to distractions. We allowed in 2013 the right of a gay marriage, also based on your rights, privileges, and immunities. So the incorporation is not complete. There are still areas where the states can defeat a lawsuit to the highest Supreme Court. But the 14th Amendment is the muscle behind all of these moves for personal freedom and gender freedom and the right of procreative control for a woman. And as I say, the 14th Amendment will be with us, and it will be debated left and right. Let me say that almost immediately, Southerners got around the 13th and 14th Amendment. The 13th, well, they couldn't get around the fact that slaves were no longer slaves, but they could lock them up for vagrancy. They could lock them up for being out after dark. They could lock them up. And what did they do? They often sent them to work on chain gangs. The state would, or the county would sell off these convicted criminals, and they led very hard, very brutal, very short lives, yet they had due process. In 1880s, the South begins to turn and get rid of the vote, the franchise. And that happened because as long as Union troops were in the occupied Confederate states, there was help for Black men and their families. And the white men who sided with the Blacks and were Republicans, they were called carpetbaggers and scallywags by Southern whites, but they acted as a protection, and they led many Southern governments during the Reconstruction era. But Northern people, who were basically pretty much as racist as Southerners, they decided that the Southern problem should be left to the South. They had labor strikes with people from Italy and Greece and Hungary and Russia and Poland, and they were burning down the railroads, and they were fighting federal troops in 1877 and the Pullman strike, and they were fighting Indians, and the idea of inferior races getting in the way. They were more amenable to the Southern position. In 1876, the South was completely reconstructed. The last there were only, excuse me, I won't say completely reconstructed, as they redeemed, as they called it. There were federal troops in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Rutherford B. Hayes was a former Union general from Ohio. He was the Republican candidate. The New York State had a Democrat, Samuel Tilden. And in the first election, Tilden had about 250,000 more votes than Hayes. But elections, as we all know, is based on electoral votes, not the popular vote. And the Republican governors in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina would not release their electoral votes. Tilden needed one more electoral vote. He was at 184, and he would have been president of the United States. And probably the first thing he would have done is pulled the Northern troops out. Go ahead. Oh, all right. Let me just say this. In a compromise of 1877, the Republicans got together with the Southerners, and they said, if you will give us a member of your cabinet, a former Confederate, and pull the troops out of the South, we will not interfere with you, Rutherford B. Hayes, being elected president. The Republicans agreed. It's called the Compromise of 1877. And the Republicans did as they were told. As they agreed, they pulled the last troops out. And we now have a quiescent period of 4 or 5 years. But by the mid-1880s, Southerners are beginning to take away what few rights Blacks had in their states.
I'd like to thank Dr. Hogle for that educational presentation. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, Dr. Hogle has provided a reference list of sources with websites that you can explore to learn more. This reference list will be linked beneath the video in the video description. I will also invite you to fill out a quick survey linked in the video description, which will take you no more than 5 minutes to fill out and will help us gather valuable information that will help us in the formation of future presentations like this one. Should you have any questions regarding the presentation itself, Dr. Hogle has made his email available so that you may contact him with any questions or comments you may have. Additionally, please do contact NAHOF with any questions, or if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. NAHOF's contact information is available on the screen. Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Hogle for providing a program for the Black History Matters series. I would also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us on this educational journey. Please remember that we will be releasing a new presentation each day this February. We hope to see you at our next presentation. Thank you.